Welcome to another episode on the Loins of History podcast. My name is Jay, and I'm joined by my co-host Colin. And this week, we're going to continue our conversation on the history of U.S. and Chinese relations by talking about, dun, 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 the end of the Qing Dynasty. So, yeah, our last episode, we talked about the Boxer Rebellion. That was kind of the beginning of the end. And this week, Colin's going to take us through what it was like when the Qing Dynasty collapsed. So, Colin, what are our key takeaways for this week?
So key takeaway number one is the Qing fell due to internal and external factors. That's very obvious, but it really came down to the loss of the mandate of heaven, which is key, and we're going to go through that. The second one was that we want to compare and contrast the rise of Japan to the fall of the Qing, and Japanese ability to effectively embrace the West while still maintaining its national identity, and China was not. And then third, after the fall of the Qing, I believe this was the start of kind of a rebirth of Chinese identity, though they were still in the midst of the century of humiliation, and the post-Qing dynasty was extremely chaotic. This is really a first step toward completely pushing out Western influence and unifying against now the Japanese oppressors, and creating this central identity that's going to be key as we move forward into the next epoch of Chinese history.
Colin, you mentioned the Mandate of Heaven. What exactly was that?
That is a really good question. So the Mandate of Heaven is an ancient concept that began back in the Zhou dynasty in 1046 BC. So we talk about how ancient the Chinese people as a history and as a culture are. I mean, this just shows you 1046 BC is almost 3,000 years ago during the Qing Dynasty. And basically what this concept is determines if a ruler is virtuous enough to rule. And that is from Kaylee Sispansky, who's a Asian studies professor. And she basically said there's 4 principles to the mandate: that heaven grants the emperor the right to rule. Since there's only one heaven, there can only be one emperor at any given time. The emperor's virtue determines his right to rule, and no one dynasty has a permanent right to rule. And Jay, when I was doing some research and thinking through this and contrasting it to some of our previous episodes about the U.S. Constitution, the first point, I think it's just really interesting comparing that to natural law, that you have two cultures and histories that have basically evolved completely independent of one another, but they still look to heaven or a higher power in order to grant them rights to rule or rights to govern. I just think that's fascinating that we see that in a lot of other cultures as well, because I think they still believe that man is fallible, man can be unvirtuous, and they can lose that right to rule. But heaven is not. Heaven is higher, and they bestow those rights upon us. I just want to point that out. I think it's fascinating that we're separated by thousands of miles, and basically we're isolated from one another on opposite ends of the planet, but they still had this ideal.
Yeah, it's
very similar to natural law.
Yeah, it's not just natural law, just like this innate human being, like, hey, when things are good, it feels like we're blessed by a higher power. And conversely, when things are bad, hey, it feels like this higher power is mad at us right now.
Well, and that's exactly when they say that that's some evidence to show that you've lost the mandate from heaven. So Professor Sispansky basically says, like, how can you tell when, in one of her papers that she published that I came across, she's like, well, how could you tell, or, how did dynasties lose this mandate of heaven? And it was like, well, it was determined by famines, floods. And if you look back, we talked about a famine caused by a huge flood that happened in the Yellow River that happened right around the time of the Taiping Rebellion, which unemployed a lot of the young male population. You had the White Lotus Rebellion, which is a little outside of the scope of this series, but that was a rebellion that occurred before the Opium Wars. You had these foreign invaders come in and basically dominate the Qing Dynasty and beat them very badly in the Opium Wars. They were carving up the country into spheres of influence, economic depression, and you just had this absolutist emperor, monarch, that was ineffective at the same time. So those were the signs that you lost the mandate of heaven. And I think it's important to understand that because there were many dynasties throughout Chinese history. And the Chinese people believed that because heaven gave this mandate and this right to rule, that it was considered just and okay to overthrow that dynasty once they lost that mandate of heaven, because they were no longer a legitimate ruler. So it's not uncommon. So these rebellions, if you put it in that context, you understand like these rebellions were actually pretty par for the course for the Chinese because they believed that the mandate had been lost. So it kind of makes sense. And, there was already, like I just said, there's these natural disasters, there's economic factors, there was ethnic conflict. The Qing Dynasty were of the Manchu people they tried to separate themselves from the predominant Han ethnic group within China. So they kind of maintained their own language and rituals and culture to try and separate themselves. And Han didn't like that. And if you look at the population of China today, I think like 91% of the country is Han Chinese. And then it's the last 9% is broken up into, much smaller ethnic groups. But so there's all of these different factors that were occurring over a period of 80 plus years that really just started showing the Chinese people that the mandate had been lost and that at some point they had to unshackle themselves from this unvirtuous ruler. So one other thing I want to point out, I think, there's the mandate of heaven that was being lost and all these signs. I came across, it was like a dissertation paper from a guy named Tuan Huixing. He made the argument that the Qing Dynasty, practically speaking, was ineffective because of the sheer size of China at the time. It was too big, both in landmass and population. So you had all of these problems occurring that I just listed out. Qing Dynasty was not oppressive in its policies, but practically speaking, it was oppressive. And it was also slow moving. And I'll break that down and why it was like that. He made the argument that, with 400 million people at this time, in order to maintain an administrative state, you had to have what he called state agents, and a lot of these state agents. And the larger the population, it almost caused the number of state agents to increase exponentially. So that created a huge burden of cost and just management that it became unmanageable just to try and manage other people. Then with the tax revenue, he said the taxes were actually pretty low, relatively speaking. But when his agents, because there are so many of them, were really corrupt. So in practice, these policies were carried out and very oppressive. So they would extort commoners and peasants. The actual revenue was being pocketed by these agents, and then what little bit was passed to the actual Qing Dynasty. So they were never getting the money that they were taxing because these middlemen, these state agents, were taking all of it. So the people were blaming the Qing Dynasty for being ineffective and oppressive, when in reality, it was just because it was so large. Then you had events in the Boxer Rebellion and the Taiping Rebellion where they were being attacked, and it took days or even weeks for them to hear about it. So they can never react fast enough. Plus all these other Western forces coming and fighting them just couldn't handle it. I just thought that was a really interesting perspective on why they seem to be so ineffective despite being so large.
Yeah. It's almost, there's some similarities between feudalism and the administrative state that was the Qing Dynasty. Like in the feudal era in Europe, you would have a king, right? If you were in France, there was a king of France, but like the king is not the person that was the immediate authority in the peasant's life, right? There was a whole structure of subordinate authorities. In France, I believe it was the Duke, right? Like these subordinate dukes were the ultimate like authority in that area. Similarly, in the Qing Empire, it's a very decentralized organization where people appeal to the emperor as the highest authority, but there would be these subordinate administrative officials that would levy taxes, usually with a significant amount of graft. Along with that, they would dole out punishments, things of that nature.
Interesting little trivia for the listeners out there. Duke actually comes from the Latin or Roman dux, which was a military governor that was created in order to not give one governor or provincial governor too much power. So they would separate the administrative state from the military state. So when we hear duke, it comes from ducks. So interesting little tidbit you can learn there.
Fun fact.
So yeah, also feudalism had, second to that is feudalism has its roots in late antiquity Rome because of the administrative state and the burdens of taxes that it created. So
right.
You're learning about Chinese history. You're learning Roman history. We're covering it all here.
Yeah. No, that's good. So Colin, when the Qing Dynasty actually collapsed, like what were some of the turmoil and rebellions going on at that time?
So, last week we talked about the Boxer Rebellion, and the Boxer Rebellion obviously was a culmination of this anti-Western sentiment that we've already discussed. The mandate of heaven is slipping away. So there was the Sino-Japanese War that occurred about 5 years before the Boxer Rebellion, where the Japanese came in utilizing Western tactics and technology, basically destroyed the Qing Dynasty's army and took large portions of territory like Korea and Taiwan. Then you had the Boxer Rebellion, which was devastating in its aftermath because the Western powers and Japan wanted to take their pound of flesh. So after that, you had the Empress Dowager try with the 100 Days of Reform, where she recognized that the impending collapse and tried to placate both the conservative elements who wanted to maintain this Qing dynasty, their cultural traditions, and the more progressive factions that wanted to change the way China was moving forward. It was too little too late. And then I think it was 2 or 3 episodes ago, we talked about railroads being built in China with investments from American businessmen. This is one of the, the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. The Chinese looked at these railroads as a means to kind of unify and bring the country together. They could more rapidly industrialize. They could move across this vast empire. And ultimately, it turned into just an abject failure. The government kept getting in the way. There were strikes. There was, the bureaucracy. Like we said, there's already a lot of corruption with these state agents. And basically nothing ended up getting built for the railroads. A huge disaster. And when that happened, you had a few different groups that began forming that were revolutionaries, basically. So you had the Tongmen Hui, which is translated roughly to the Chinese United League. And that was founded by Sun Yat-sen. He's going to be a very important figure later. And then there was also the Progressive Society and Literary Societies. And they began collaborating in about 1905 on how to overthrow the Qing Dynasty. And like I said, this is not, and I have to think that Empress Dowager kind of recognized that these rebellions and uprisings were going to keep happening because she knew in her mind that the mandate of heaven was being lost. The perception of it was lost. So I think that was some of those frantic last minute actions like the 100 Days of Reform, things like that. And actually, they even tried to model a new constitution. They started opening discussions around a parliamentary system. But like I said, it was too little too late. So in 1911, these different revolutionary groups came up with a plan to overthrow the Qing Dynasty. And it started on October 10th, 1911. And they were going to take over a city called Huiguang. And what happened there, they ended up taking it over and a few of the other cities around it. And the Qing Dynasty dispatched Yuan Shikai, and the Battle of Yangtze ensued. Yuan and his army actually were successful, and they took a few of the cities back, and the Qing Dynasty believed that they had put down the rebellion. But in reality, Yuan Shikai was actually negotiating with the revolutionaries without the Qing Dynasty understanding what was going on. Suddenly, the revolutionaries, he sided with the revolutionaries, and they began sending out messages to all of the different provinces of the Qing Empire to rebel and throw off the yoke of the Qing dynasty, which they all did. And it happened so quickly. These revolutionary leaders were actually gone because they thought this was going to take a long time. So they were doing different parts to try and rally support behind their cause. As a matter of fact, Sun Yat-sen was in the United States at the time trying to gather support from Chinese immigrants to finance the uprising. And he had to come back as fast as he possibly could because the rebellion was successful, which is, I think it's just kind of funny. It was like it was so successful that it caught everybody off guard, including the revolutionaries themselves. And so that happened October 10th and 11th. By January 1st, 1912, the Qing Dynasty was effectively dissolved, and Sun Yat-sen was elected the first president of the Chinese Republic, or the Republic of China, excuse me, with the last ruler of Imperial China abdicating the throne. So, and this is pretty, like, the significance of this event in Chinese history shouldn't be minimized. This was the last of Imperial China, something that had stretched back 3,000 years. And this was it ended. It culminated and completed at this moment.
Yeah, it's fascinating because there's so much like this period, this uprising that kind of like sealed the deal for or broke the camel's back, so to speak, that ended the Qing Dynasty. Like you said, it was just one more revolution, one more uprising amongst a host of rebellions and discord that had been taking place for so long. But what happened in 1911 set the stage for a period of chaos, really up until 1949, when the communists took over. So this is the beginning of a 38-year period of just like pure chaos for China. Like, it was already bad for the, roughly, quick math, 70-ish years prior to that. But like, things get even worse after this period.
No, you're right. And I think when the Qing Dynasty, the last 70 years that we talked about were bad, but there was still a semblance of like, okay, we can look to the emperor, empress. We can look to our rulers and our leaders. And there was a national direction. There's obviously external forces and some internal revolutionaries and rebellions, but there was still a China. Like, we enter a period of, they call it the era of warlords, where there was just tons, I think there was over 10 different factions. I mean, there's probably even more than that, but 10 main factions. You had the communists fighting the nationalists. There was no real order. And Western powers definitely withdrew from the country, starting with the Boxer Rebellion, but they really started withdrawing. And in that vacuum, the Japanese stepped in and really took control.
Right. And we briefly touched on this in our last episode at the end, talking about the Boxer Rebellion, because the Western powers takeaway from the Boxer Rebellion was, whoa, this is a little much for us. We're gonna withdraw our influence. We realize now that maybe carving up chunks of territory and annexing them, kind of similar to what the French had done in like Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. I think they kind of realized, hey, this is not possible in China. The Japanese, on the other hand, were like, heck yeah.
So, Jay, that's actually a really good segue that we can come back to Japan, because I do want to compare Japan and China in this next key takeaway, because both countries were, exposed or had to confront Western powers around the same time. And both of them were probably at about the same, they both had similar, they were both kind of isolated. They were both at the same stage of technological advancement, but they both reacted to Western influence very differently. And it's important that we understand this, because Chinese and Japanese relations are going to define the next 100 years from here. Well, and even for us, the next 100 years. So the next 200 years from where we're starting off here. So it's very important to understand this and why they have such a tension. And this kind of starts it. So with Japan, and mind you, this is not a podcast about Japanese history. So I definitely recommend that you go out and study some of this stuff on your own, because I'm really going to just touch on it. But we could have our own podcast about Japanese history. Very fascinating stuff. So we're going to go back to the Meiji Restoration. So Matthew Perry, and when I say Matthew Perry, I don't mean Chandler Bing from Friends. I mean Commodore Matthew. Commodore Matthew Perry entered Edo Bay in 1854, and this is a very significant event because this is where he basically came in with the U.S. backing behind him, saying, Japan, open up, we're going to trade with you. And by trade with you, it means we're going to impose our trade on you, similar to what was going on in China. That's kind of what the West came in with, that mentality. And when I just kind of have this, I can't remember where I read it. It was a description of him coming into the bay where the Japanese saw the American ships and they were in awe of these massive ships and these huge guns and these Western uniforms and weapons that they had. And, as the Americans came in, they would see these almost medieval banners with the shogunate and all of the samurai. They had these massive banners flying, but they were built on, these are banners and flags flying. They had wooden buildings still. So it was still 100 or so years behind where the West was technologically. And the Japanese looked on at the Americans and said, we're behind. We need to catch up. That was the part of the difference between them and China. They knew immediately they needed to change. So with the Meiji Restoration between 1866 and 1869, like I said, they recognized that they were behind. So the Hisamitsu of Satsuma Domain and Kido Takayoshi of Chosu Domain formed an alliance, and they wanted to overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate. And long story short, I'm just going to summarize this. There was what was called the Bashin War, where Tokugawa Yoshinobu ended up surrendering to Edo Castle on April 11th, 1869. It basically ended the shogunate. So the Hisamitsu and Kido Takayoshi, basically they said, we cannot advance as a society continuing this shogunate type of rule. We have to change. We have to modernize. So what they did in order to defeat the shogunate was they brought in Western advisors, Western military experts. They embraced Western weapons and tactics, and they utilized that against the samurai. I'm sure everyone is familiar with The Last Samurai and Tom Cruise, but that is basically a Hollywood rendition of what was occurring at this point. So you had it was basically a cultural and military civil war occurring in Japan over, it's the traditionalists versus the modernists. And the modernists won utilizing the Western tactics and weapons. And what was really interesting was after the Meiji Restoration, when the shogunate ended up surrendering Edo Castle, they abolished the 4-tier class structure. They established a modern army and a modern navy, which is important. I'll get to that later. So they had uniforms, weapons, tactics, got rid of the samurai. They ordered universal education for both boys and girls, and they wanted to improve manufacturing because they saw the ability of the West to produce these weapons, and they wanted to replicate that, and they wanted to modernize their economy in order to support that, which is very important. And then eventually in 1889, they issued the Meiji Constitution, which was actually modeled after the Prussians. And eventually they kind of changed it again in about 40 years, almost to a more American or British style parliamentary system. But you can see here, contrast that to the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty resisted the West in all of the wrong ways. So rather than taking the best of the West and trying to maintain a cultural identity, they resisted culturally, but they allowed the Westerners to come in and basically impose their will militarily. And they weren't able to put up much of a fight. And we saw how that worked out for them. They lost the mandate of heaven. They had all of these unequal treaties where they were not even seen as equals for decades. Whereas the Japanese said, we're going to take the best, their weapons, their manufacturing, their technology, and we're going to combine that with our national identity. So even though we've overthrown the shogunate, we are going to go back to this tradition of Japanese nationalism, and we are going to utilize that in order to build this imperial Japan. And it's amazing to see that we think of imperialism as very Western. Well, the Japanese did imperialism very well because with this Meiji Restoration and this move toward heavy manufacturing and industrialization, they needed fuel in order to keep this machine going. So Japan is not exactly resource rich, but China is. Some of these like Indonesia, Indochina, some of these other areas are. So the Japanese began to expand aggressively. And they expanded aggressively against China. They moved in. And with that, as they continued to expand, they realized that they needed more weapons and more guns to defend these borders. So it just became this continuous cycle of Imperial Japan gaining influence and power, to the point that in the 20s and 30s that they were considered a world power by Westerners, and they were invited to naval conferences and different military exercises to observe and participate in, because they were viewed as an imperial power. And we saw their effectiveness against the Chinese when they fought in World War II and the United States. So I just think it's interesting that Japan embraced what they could and held on to what they thought was important. And they had such a nationalistic identity that they even brought back the concept of Tenno, which I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, but that's basically, again, the divine right to rule. So they embraced this Tenno, which is what translated to heavenly emperor. It was basically like the head of state. The emperor was bestowed this power from heaven. Again, like we show in China, like we show in natural law, they appeal to this higher power, that they had this, they were a heavenly emperor, and they were a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that, but we just see that they were able to hold this identity, and it was very, very effective and very powerful. There's even, just a little sidebar, they had such a reverence for the emperor and the leader of Japan, and such a nationalistic identity, that they would fight to the death to defend Japan in this source. I think you've all heard the story of the Japanese soldier who was still fighting the U.S. into the 1970s. He was basically marooned on an island and refused to surrender until the Japanese came and told him that, yeah, we surrendered like 30 years ago. That's how powerful it was. So,
yeah. Well, it's interesting, and this is a good lead into the point. That Japanese soldier, he finally surrendered when they found his old commander. Like, there was such a respect for authority that there had been other Japanese citizens, I think journalists, that had come and told him, like, bro, we surrendered. And he was like, nah, I don't believe it. Until like they found his old commander and were like, hey, you're relieved of your post. And he was like, cool, thanks. and this is interesting, because what I was really glad when we started comparing and contrasting the fall of the shogunate with the fall of the Qing Dynasty here. Both countries have a respect for authority that those of us, particularly here in the United States, don't have. However, so they're similar in that way. However, they're different in that Japan, being a smaller and homogeneous country, the Meiji Restoration was able to take place and then create a period of relative peace and growth after the Boshin War, whereas when the Qing collapsed, it was not a period of peace. It was this warlord period. So both countries have similar power structures. There's an emperor, right? And in Japan, even under the shogunate, there was an emperor, but the shogun was the de facto head of the country. When the daimyos, or the subordinate regional people, came in and said, hey, we're going to put the emperor back in power, something similar happened in 1910, 1911, when the Qing collapsed. The problem was that because China's so huge and it's not homogenous, we often forget that. We think, oh, they're Chinese. Like, and even amongst Han, like, not all Han are created this.
There's the Hakka, which were instrumental in the Taiping Rebellion. So yeah, that's a good point.
Right.
Which they're a subset of Han.
Right. because China is not a homogenous country, even though there's these subordinate leaders have a higher tendency to just either one, declare themselves emperor, or two, just decide we're not following the emperor for whatever reason. Whereas that was a long shot in Japan, to my knowledge, going all the way back to even the Sengoku Jedi, right? Like
Powerful.
the warring states period in Japan. There wasn't really a whole lot of independence from one another, like from Satsuma, which is in the Satsuma clan, all the way in the southern part of Japan, up to like the more northern folks in I'm trying to think of the name of a clan off the top of my head.
Don't worry, it's not a Japanese history podcast.
Right. They were like the Date and the Hojo. There we go. Some up northern clans, like they weren't declaring themselves independent kingdoms at that time. Rather, they were just vying for the same title of shogun. Whereas in China, it was like, I'm the emperor now. Whereas in Japan, everyone's like, no, there's still an emperor, and we nominally submit under this person. So I say all that to say is this is what helps explain, like, when the Meiji Restoration took place, there was peace afterwards. Whereas when the Qing Dynasty collapsed, it was chaos because of that non-homogeneous society in China.
No, that is good. And the peace was internal, because externally, I mentioned the Sino-Japanese War, where the Japanese were starting to fill the vacuum as Westerners started pulling out and said, we're going to take Korea, because they viewed it almost as like a dagger to their heart, because it was very close to their island. And the Japanese were, I think, historically always very, the sea always defended them. They had very stormy seas. There's stories of the Mongols trying to invade, and basically a divine wind or a hurricane, a storm, if you will, destroyed the fleets both times. But Korea is very close to Japan. So if you're going to invade Japan, you probably could do it from Korea. It might be the shortest distance. Anyway, they ended up taking Korea. They took Taiwan. And then they fought the Russians as well after, I think it was 1905 with the Russo-Japanese War. And they crushed the Russians. Their navy, I think there's a book called War Made New, which is a pretty good book. I read it about 10 years ago or so. And they talk about, they contrast the Russian Navy sailing all the way from the Atlantic around South Africa into the Pacific, and how poorly they performed against the Japanese, because the Japanese modeled their Navy after the British, and they were extremely disciplined, and they fought a larger Russian Navy and destroyed it. And it really kind of opened the eyes of the West, I think, to the power that the Japanese were going to be capable of as they continued to grow. Yeah. And, to the point that it's interesting, in World War I, the Japanese were not, World War I was predominantly European. There were, fought in Europe. There were other places where World War I was fought outside of Europe, but mainly the focus was there. Contrast to World War II, where it was really everywhere. In World War I, the Japanese saw this as an opportunity to export and become and fill the void. So their exports tripled, which is pretty impressive. And then they saw this as an opportunity to learn and sell weapons and make better weapons and export and grow their empire and their reach within the Pacific as the Europeans began pulling out even further. So I just want to make that point. And I think we've hammered it home, the difference between the Qing, the rise of the Japanese, and the fall of the Chinese.
Here's another interesting point. When a decisive military victory occurs, that tends to give your country a whole lot of prestige, a whole lot of wasta that can last decades. For the United States, we've talked about this before on this podcast, when we completely shellacked the Iraqi military in the first Gulf War, that sent reverberations throughout the international community that a lot of Americans don't quite understand, because we look back at it on it and go, oh, that was Iraq.
They were the
Right?
fourth largest army in the world.
Right. And furthermore, they were trained and supplied by the Russians. And the Russians looked at that and went, oh, crap. Like, they don't look at that and go, oh, it was the Iraqis. They look at it and go, that was us. Like, with, obviously, like, there were no Russians there, to my knowledge. But, like, that military victory so quickly, so decisively, that establishes American military prestige in the eyes of other countries even today. When Japan beat the Russians in 1905, that established Japanese prestige in a way that China never had. If we remember back in in the Boxer Rebellion, when you had these foreign troops over here, China did not levy a decisive military victory against Western powers. They got beat. Now, there were some very small exceptions to that rule. Like we talked about, the Boxers actually did beat the Seymour expedition, but that was so, the Seymour expedition was 2,000 people and they were facing tens of thousands of Boxers. So like nobody really looked at that as the Qing, like they're here.
Back.
Whereas in 1905, when the Japanese obliterated the Russian Navy. Now, the last point I'll make about this is, and I'm going to take a cheap shot at the Russians. It wouldn't be the last time the Russians got swagged. But everyone thought like, oh man, we thought this force was inferior to the Russians. And what we all found out was that the Russians like to talk a big talk and they don't back it up. Y'all, the Russian military is notoriously bad.
It's funny.
So good job, Japan. You beat the Russians. Like,
I just remember reading that book, in War Made New. He makes a really good point to like talk about so like that trip from I think they left out of St. Petersburg, maybe Archangel, one of the two. I can't remember, but it took several months for them to get around, and the whole time, like they talk about I guess he was the Russian admiral who led it. Like he didn't do any training exercises. They just drank vodka the whole way. Like they weren't practicing. They weren't, practicing reloading, targeting their guns, sighting them in, making sure everything worked efficiently this entire time. Whereas the Japanese were. They knew that their ships were not on paper technically as large. They didn't have the prestige. So they were very highly disciplined, and they fought. And you could see it play out in the battle. The Russian ships oftentimes they didn't stay in the formations that they were supposed to. Their guns were inaccurate, whereas the Japanese were just so effective. But you're talking about the Russians, and then you get into World War One, and then World War II, and then the Cold War, and you're like, wow, maybe there's something to this.
Sorry, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but it's worth talking about because I love bashing on Russians. So the Japanese banzai charge, right? The reason why they did that in the first part of World War II was because that worked against the Russians. And it somewhat worked against the Chinese later as well. Essentially, in you talking about the Russian Navy just drinking vodka on the way in its transit over to the Sea of Japan, the Russo-Japanese War started by the Japanese launching a surprise attack prior to a declaration of war against the Russians in Port Arthur. Fascinating thing, because the Russians had a fairly significant military presence there in Port Arthur, which, for our listeners, Port Arthur at the time. It was called Port Arthur. It was a Russian-controlled naval base in I think it's pronounced the Liaodong Peninsula, there in the Yellow Sea. It's currently part of China. The Japanese had taken it after the first Sino-Japanese War, but then conceded it back to the Russians
at the behest of the West.
Right. After pressure, because the West was like, oh shoot, the Japanese are a lot stronger than what we thought. So the Russians controlled it, and essentially they had a fairly significant military presence there. Nobody thought the Japanese was going to military take it, and then in 1905 they were like, "Attack, banzai!" and they obliterated the Russians in Port Arthur. At hindsight, we look back on it and go like the military, the Russian military commander, they're very similar things. That's what made me think of this. Very similar. This dude was just like, three sheets in the wind on some really good vodka. They got completely obliterated. And the lesson learned for the Japanese was quick surprise attacks in force are successful. And yeah, they're successful because you did it against the Russians. Like, this is why Hitler wrongfully thought, oh, we just, in 1940 or 41, if we just kick the door down, the whole rotten structure will come down. Like, Hitler thought the lesson was, oh, the Russians are just a paper bear, so to speak, and it'll all collapse. That's why the Japanese thought, oh, if we just, banzai charge these guys, it'll all fall down. What they learned, though, was that when you start doing that against U.S. Marines and soldiers, you're all going to die. And
At a high cost.
And at high cost, yeah. And they stopped doing that later on in the war and started fighting these attrition tactics, which, were a lot harder to beat. Anyway, I say all that to say is that the decisive military victories that China won against Russia, clap, clap, yay, yay.
Excuse me, Japan. You meant Japan.
Or Japan, sorry, Japan. The decisive military victories that Japan won against Russia, great job, you beat the Russians, created this deterrent effect, whereas China, on the other hand, never had that decisive military victory because they were primarily fighting the British, which was a way more competent military force. Shout out to all our British listeners.
We do have a large contingent of British listeners. I think the term probably would be professional. The Russian military, historically speaking, it's just not professional. They kind of show up and get paid, but they don't do things that typical Western armies are known for, like precision and drill. And they just don't have that in the British Navy, the British military. It's much smaller than the Russians, but they're highly disciplined and professional. So they're very effective, which is what the Japanese saw and wanted to model themselves after.
Right.
So
yeah, the Chinese didn't have it fair, right? The Chinese were fighting the best military on the face of the planet at that time, whereas the Japanese fighting the Russians were not fighting the best military on the face of the planet.
Well, I think they kind of avoided that by saying, like, when the U.S. came in and they're like, hey, we're going to trade with you, and they're like, okay, show us how to fight.
Yeah,
and I think that alleviated some of the problems, but. That was quite the tangent there on some of Japanese history, but I think it was great. I think the point has been driven home, though, that Japan was on the ascent. China was going into chaos at this point.
Right.
Bringing it back to kind of a third takeaway, and we're not going to spend a lot of time right now on the post-Qing Dynasty China, because that's probably going to be mostly into the next episode. But there's a few things I want to talk about and what it looked like in those initial years after the Qing Dynasty before we get into next week's episode. So like we said, that Sun Yat-sen was elected as the first president of the Republic of China. He was only a temporary president. And the general Yuan Shikai actually assassinated Sun Yat-sen's successor. He assassinated him, and then his army took over, basically, and he was running the country as a dictatorship. So it was the Republic of China on paper, and really he was the one that was calling the shots as this dictator, backed by with his Biang army, was essentially just running it as a dictatorship. So, and actually, as a matter of fact, right afterward, there was a point where he tried to set up a full-blown empire of China, and that failed. And then in 1916, the Qing Dynasty, actually, there was a moment of restoration. Before that collapsed in on itself, and it began what was called the warlord era from 1916 to 1928. And I'm going to leave it here, but kind of a preview looking forward. This was defined where you have the KMT, or the Kuomintang nationalists. They were a major faction that was fighting. The CCP and the Communist Party were fighting all of these different factions, and what they were trying to do was reunify China. But these warlords were, like Jay was saying before, they just broke apart, and a lot of them were like, "We're going to do our own thing. Like, we have this region of China, and we are going to run it the way we want to." And Chiang Shek wanted to unify China, and he begins a expedition, and I don't want to say quest because that feels so video game-ish, but basically he begins a mission to reunify China. But I think this is my interpretation of history right here. I think this is kind of where, in this moment of chaos, where the Chinese have pushed out Westerners, they are dealing with the Japanese, but they are in a moment where the seedlings of a new Chinese identity are beginning to form. And we're going to see that manifest eventually as the Chinese Communist Party, when Chairman Mao eventually takes power. But I think, these moments of kind of chaos and anarchy and this vacuum of power, I think, are really where new dynasties, which, I mean, honestly, the Chinese Communist Party is kind of a dynasty in and of itself, sort of take over. And I think this is a pivotal moment in Chinese history. And I'm excited to talk more about this chaotic period and what the U.S. was doing, because this whole series is really devoted to U.S. and Chinese relations. And this was very Chinese focused. I think we're going to bring in the U.S. and see what they were doing at this period too, as well, next week.
Right. Also, stuff that's just super fascinating to me about all this, because we often just skip ahead to World War II, right?
Yeah.
We don't even talk about World War I in Asia, but like even before World War I, most Americans, I don't know about Westerners, but most Americans, like, we just don't get taught in school Asian history aside from like a few key points.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's fascinating. So the emperor that abdicated in 1911, the last emperor of the Qing, of the actual hereditary Qing dynasty, was a guy named Puyi.
The Forbidden
This
City.
dude, so this dude later, so he was just a kid when he abdicated. Later, when the Japanese took over all of Manchuria, the Japanese set this guy up, the former emperor of China. He became the dictator, the president, I don't know, of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo.
I would consider that like Vichy France. Vichy France.
Yeah. Like, he's the guy that the Japanese put in charge of Manchukuo, which to me is fascinating, because Manchukuo plays an interesting role in World War II, and it was led by the former emperor, the last emperor of the Qing Dynasty. I had no idea.
Well,
like the Qing, quote unquote, the Qing were still in charge of Manchuria, which is where they came from, the Manchus, right? And that was like the end of the Qing Dynasty, was actually underneath the Japanese, still in charge of Manchuria through World War II. Fascinating.
And they probably also knew that the Qing Dynasty, historically speaking, from their experience, was very weak and easily controlled.
Yeah. It makes me wonder, this is probably true, it makes me wonder if the Japanese did that on purpose with a greater intent on China in the future. So they were like, hey, we're in charge of Manchuria now. We're going to put the former Qing emperor under us as our puppet, so that when we take over more parts of China later, we can continue to say like, hey, we're just restoring the Qing dynasty. Like, you guys are really in charge. But in fact, like, the Japanese are doing whatever they want. I don't know, but it makes me wonder if that was kind of the future intent.
They
if they didn't
probably
lose
looked
World
at
War
the
II.
other. They probably looked back at the Eight Nation Alliance and their experience in China and saw that like, hey, it's really tough to just come in and rule this place. Like maybe we should have somebody else do the heavy lifting, and they just answer to us.
Colin, thank you so much for that fascinating history of the fall of the Qing Dynasty. I particularly enjoyed the comparing and contrasting that with the Meiji Restoration and just what was going on in Japan. Uh, Listeners, I hope you all enjoyed this episode as well. If you did, please be sure to give us a 5-star review in whatever podcast service that you're listening to. If that's Apple Podcasts, just scroll down, click the 5 stars. Give us a brief take on what you thought of the episode. If you're on Spotify, same thing, 5-star review. You can do that from your phone. That is the best way to help get the word out about this podcast, and that tells the algorithm that we're here. We're also on social media. You can give us feedback there. We love hearing it. If you have any constructive criticism, we'd love to hear that as well. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can find us there by just searching Loins of History, and you can communicate with us on social media. Lastly, if you really enjoyed this episode and you want to help us produce more content, you can always support this podcast as well. We have a Patreon page, and there's also, if you're for Spotify listeners, you can click the support button as well, in that we greatly appreciate our supporters already. So looking forward to next week talking about what the U.S. thought of all of this, and we're looking forward to joining everyone next week on the Loins of History.